all about. And I think God's in this. I think it's a timely topic as we look at what's going on in our world today. In fact, every week we see something new that's kind of broken that can lead to some unrest. We see unrest in the world all around us. Growing unrest. I don't know about you, but I'm almost afraid to turn the news on in the morning or to look at a paper or however it is that you get your updates. Just not knowing what's going to happen during the course of the night and what has changed in the process of a day. I know several of you commented on the way out how they appreciated the talk about current events, and it's hard to know sometimes where to land in some of these areas, isn't it? It's kind of hard to know what to believe. How do you balance an offended sense of justice? Can we word it that way? How do we balance that with a Christ-like compassion? Both are important. And so I was thinking about that quite a bit this week, and I want to just share a couple of potential resources for you, and then maybe a few reminders and suggestions from a practical basis. This is kind of an introduction before we get to the actual message. But as I was thinking about this, my mind went back to 1 Peter, because that's just where we came through. Do you remember back in the end of 2024 election cycle, we were in 1 Peter chapter 2, and I did a series, 2 messages talking about how do we honor God and fear the King, and the idea of the role of government. And if you weren't here for that, and even if you were, it might be helpful for you to go back and listen to those again. If you have a bulletin, you want to write it down, it's November 13th and 20th of 2024. There you can find the videos on our YouTube channel. You can go to the website and you can find older messages and you could pull those out. But that might be an encouragement to you. What is the role and responsibility of government? What's our responsibility to the government? And that passage was timely at that point. I think it fits pretty well here also. Secondly, as far as a resource, I came across an article this week. It was entitled ICE and the Rule of Law. And it was written by a Christian pastor. I don't know the man personally. I don't know a lot about him. So I'm not suggesting or recommending everything that this man may or may not have written. But this article was well done. And I appreciated the thoughts that he brought out. And I made a few copies of those, and it's on the pulpit on the way out there at the top of the ramp. You're welcome to grab one of those copies if you'd be interested in reading that. I think it helps to put our mind in the right direction. And I think those could be helpful for you. As far as practical reminders and suggestions, this goes for what's going on in the world now, but I think straight across the board. One, exercise discernment. Exercise discernment. And what I mean by that is don't believe everything that you read, don't believe everything that you see. And then I'll qualify that from either side. There's the agendas out there, and be wary of those zoomed in clips or those short little clips that just show something that's designed to prey on your emotion. It doesn't give any context to what's going on. Be careful about that. We're of the generation where if we see it with our eyes, we believe it, right? Because you can't argue with photographic evidence or video evidence. Well, that's not the way the world works anymore. And so we need to be careful with that. So be wary. Don't make snap judgments. Often there's more to a story than what's immediately seen. I think that's helpful for me as I remind myself of that. Number 2, I've mentioned this before, relationships are more important than politics. And we can get sucked into our political ideology and the things that we think are true, and we can still hold on to those tightly. I'm not saying we should abandon that. But we need to also extend grace to those who don't see things exactly as we do. Not every conversation has to go there. You know what I'm saying? And so there's times we just need to speak up. There's times we need to keep our mouth shut. And we need to pray for God to give us the wisdom to know the difference between the two. And I think that'll be helpful. It is for me. There's times I just need to close my mouth. And I know some of you are thinking, wow, that's hard. Because you know me, right? Peter talks about living the beautiful life there in 1 Peter chapter 2. And it's right before this section on submission to government. And to live that life that he wants us to live, I think that's important. Number 3, keep your focus on Christ, not on your media outlet of choice. I don't know where you get your news or where you get your information. Stay informed. It's important. We're living in this world. We're in this world. We're not of this world, but we need to be informed about what's going on. But don't let it consume you. Don't get sucked in to this thing, what's going on in this world, because if we get sucked into that, it's going to take our eyes off of Christ. And if we get sucked in and we focus on that instead of Christ, what's going to happen? We're going to have angst and we're going to have unrest in our soul. And that's precisely what we don't want to have happen. And I would say this, when you feel that start to happen, balance your input. Turn off the TV, shut your computer, and take some dedicated time to spend with your God. That's where the peace and the rest will come from. So balance those things out. Keep your focus on Christ, not on your media outlet of choice. Number 4, the most powerful tool in your arsenal as a Christian citizen is prayer. Folks, that's something that we can do that will make a difference. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul says this, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications and prayers and intercessions and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, for presidents, for those in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior. That's our powerful tool. As a Christian citizen, we need to spend time in prayer. And then number 5, this probably goes without saying, but just remind yourself periodically through the day that God's in control. This doesn't caught God off guard. God's not up in heaven wringing his hands trying to figure out what to do with what's happening in Minneapolis. Okay? We can struggle with that, and we can have different opinions of how we'd like to see that handled. But God is ultimately in control. Don't allow the unrest in our world to put unrest in your soul and unrest in your heart. And I think these 5 ideas will help you with that. All right, now to the message. We've got the little intro out of the way. And if you've got questions or maybe you need some help with that, I don't know that I have all the answers. I know that I don't. But I'd be glad to help you if you'd like that. The world's in a state of unrest. We see that everywhere we look. And we talked about that quite a bit last week. And we also mentioned the fact that if we're honest, we often will have to admit that we experience unrest in our hearts as well. Times where things can get turbulent on the inside. And there's a lot of reasons for it. The unrest in the world is certainly part of it. It might come on to financial burdens that you're facing can cause that unrest. It can be work situations. It can be ongoing medical struggles. It can be some struggles, some personality struggles with somebody else. It can be physical exhaustion. Maybe it's family problems. Maybe it's a spiritual battle that you're facing. I got a text from a young lady who's counseled out at camp. She grew up in our Bible camp. She's now in Bible college. And she prefaced it this way. Do you remember when you said that Satan always attacks before you would try something for God or just after a great spiritual victory? And when someone prefaces their text that way, you know what's coming, right? And anyway, we were able to just encourage her a little more and pray with her in that situation. But it's a reminder that these ongoing things can be a struggle. God does not want us to live every day with noise and unrest in our soul. He doesn't want us to live that way. He wants us to have peace, and he's given us a solution in his word, a prescription, if you would, for peace. We started looking at that last week, and we're going to finish this passage here in Matthew chapter 11. We're going to come back to this. It's kind of going to be a bit of an outline for our study, but we'll come back to it after we finish it up. But let's look at Matthew 11. Let's read these verses again, and then let's finish the text here and see what Matthew and Jesus have to say to us. In verse 28, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Last week we looked at the first verse and we saw this invitation to come to him. Jesus Christ offering for us to come and to come to him for rest. And we saw just quickly it was an open invitation. It's available to all. But we saw that it was a directed invitation. It was an invitation given to those who labor and those who are heavy laden. And you remember that word labor was a general term, a broad term, and it includes all kinds of toil, all kinds of burdens, all kinds of griefs. And the thought there is none of us are going to be facing something that exempts us from being able to come to Christ. Every single thing that we're facing qualifies us to come to him. The idea of heavy laden was a burden that was beyond our control, loaded upon us, and maybe multiple burdens loaded upon us until the bow of our ship is barely out of the water and the slightest wave or the slightest rocking of the boat brings water over the top. Have you ever been there in your life where you felt that way? Where you just weren't sure if you were going to make it? Together they leave us exhausted and overwhelmed. And it's to those people that Jesus is saying, come unto me. We saw also that it was an urgent invitation. Remember, it's in the imperative mode. He's calling us to come and to come to him now. It's the idea of come. It's a cry, it's a call, it's an interjection. Come to me before it's too late. We saw next that it was an intimate invitation. Jesus is calling us to come to him personally. Isn't it nice to know that he's not going to outsource your need to some third level angel that, we've got to be careful how we qualify that, but you understand the picture. How many of you, when you go to visit your doctor, really enjoy it when you can actually talk to your doctor instead of a physician's assistant, right? Here we see the idea, Jesus says, you can come to me personally, and I will give you rest. It's an intimate invitation. And finally, it was an effectual invitation, which is just a fancy way of saying it's going to get results. If I come to him the way he prescribes for me to come, the result will be rest. I will give you rest. It's a promise. It's a coming that results in a refreshing, calming, quieting rest. What a wonderful invitation that we saw last week. But as we move on in the passage into the next couple of verses, we're going to see, secondly, there's also an initiation. And I think you'll see what I mean by that. I hope you see what I mean by that here in just a moment. But we look at this invitation in verse 28 to come to him, and it brings comfort to our hearts. We come and we kind of offload our burden there, and we experience this rest. We come burdened and beaten down by the cares of life. And we enjoy that rest in verse 28, but then we read on in the passage, and he says in a little bit, and it kind of shocks us, take my yoke upon you. And then later on in the verse, we see some things about a yoke and about a burden. And maybe we think to ourselves, wait a second, I just came to Christ and got rid of my burden. What's this talk about me now picking up and carrying another burden and another yoke? I just got rid of mine. Why are you asking me to place another one on my shoulders? It's interesting as we think about that. To me, it points out to us that rest and peace, it's not the absence of toil. It's not the absence of labor. It's not the absence of grief. But rather, it's peace in the midst of the storm. God says, I'll give you peace, but I need you to come my way. And sometimes God's way doesn't look exactly like we thought it would. And we're going to see that as we look here in this passage. He wants us to come to him, but we've got to come and we've got to do it his way. What does it demand from me to come to Christ and really experience the peace and the rest that he offers? First of all, we see that it demands surrender. Look at what he says here. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. We see two thoughts here. First of all, we see surrender. There's an action that I must take. There's something that I have to do. In my coming to him, once I'm there, now I have to do something. I have to take my yoke, his yoke, upon me. The idea of take there means to lift or to elevate from the ground, but it also has the idea of once I picked it up, I've got to carry it. I've got to carry it with me as I travel down through life. To bear is not a bad idea as far as that understanding of the word. It's the same word in Matthew 16 where Jesus says, come after me and take up your cross and follow me. It's the same word. It's the same idea. And again, we see that it's in the imperative mode. And so both coming and taking up my yoke, his yoke, are prerequisites to peace and rest. Wow, I can't talk. Prerequisites, that's a hard word to say, I guess, this time of morning. So there is an action that I must take. Secondly, there is a yoke that I need to wear. I need to surrender to this yoke. I need to be willing to put it on. So what's a yoke? We don't live in quite the agrarian society where people are out there farming with oxen, right? They're using tractors and combines and a lot bigger equipment, a lot more expensive equipment. So we may not have this first-hand understanding of what a yoke is, but we do know what it means. It's an instrument that joins two animals together so that they can combine their efforts for the work. We know it's usually made out of wood. It goes around the neck. Things that go around our neck and rest on our shoulders, it's going to be a little bit restraining and confining. It's going to be a bit cumbersome. But again, we come back to the idea that it allows the strength of two to be combined together and applied to the task. Not quite the same illustration, the same way of doing it, but I have a couple of harnesses that I carry with me when I go hunting. And if you end up putting a deer down and you're way back into the prairie or in the woods, wherever you're at, and if you have to have somebody with you, it's interesting to be able to tie those to the animal, and each one of you puts a strap around your shoulders, and now as you're pulling in tandem, and two of you are able to pull the load together way more easily than one person could do it. Last fall, we were able to pull a deer Deere out with 3 of us and a couple of harnesses, and it made all the difference in the world as we got it out before dark. This yoke. But you know, a yoke requires submission and surrender. The oxen have to submit themselves to the yoke being put upon them. There's a couple of you guys that'll remember this illustration as we were in Benin, Africa, many, many years ago. And we were looking out over the wall of the mission station. We could see the pond down there, and we could see some individuals trying to get 2 oxen into a yoke. There was one that was experienced. He'd been in the yoke before, but this other one, he didn't want anything to do with it. And he was kicking and thrashing and carrying on. I thought he was going to tear things apart. I thought people were going to get kicked. He was not willing to submit to it. That ox had incredible strength, but that strength was of no value because he wasn't willing to submit to the yoke. And so I think we see here that it requires us to submit to the yoke as well. I've got to be willing to put that yoke upon my neck. As you see in your outline, there's another thought that this entails as well. In order for me to surrender to the yoke that Jesus wants to put upon my neck, I've got to first give up the one that I was carrying first. I've got to be willing to take that one off. We don't see that stated specifically or in the passage, but it's definitely implied, isn't it? How can I put on his yoke if I haven't taken my yoke off? There's not room on my neck for 2 yokes, right? So I've got to take mine off first. And I think this is really part of this idea of coming to him and allowing him to rest us, as we saw there in verse 28. In order for him to take our burden and give us rest, we have to be willing to let it go. We've got to be willing to let that burden go, and we have to take it off of our shoulders. You say, well, why are you making a big deal out of this? This seems kind of trivial. It seems pretty obvious. But have you ever noticed that sometimes it's kind of hard for us to do? There's burdens that you may have been carrying for a significant amount of time. Maybe you've been carrying this burden, this struggle, this thing for most of your life. And maybe over the course of time, that trauma, that burden, that struggle has come to define you. And now Jesus Christ is saying, if you really want to experience rest and peace in your life, you've got to be willing to let that go. You've got to be willing to take that off so that you can carry my load and my burden. Really, this surrender is about giving up control, isn't it? And that's a hard thing sometimes for us to be willing to do. And I don't want to minimize whatever struggles it is that you may have gone through in this life. I'm not going to minimize the trauma, maybe the abuse, whatever it was, but we can hold so tightly onto those things and claim that as our identity and then refuse to be willing to let that go so that Jesus Christ can give us the rest and the peace that we want. Sometimes that's what's standing in the way of rest and peace. And so it's important that we take the burden that we're carrying and that we offload that. I've got to be willing to give up control. It's all about surrender. You see, if I'm carrying my yoke, I can do it my way. But if I'm carrying his yoke, I need to carry it his way. And I think sometimes that's a struggle for us to be willing to go down that road. We're used to carrying it our way, but then again, if we think about this, isn't it the doing it our way that's led to the unrest and the weariness in our soul? We've got to be willing to let that go and do it his way. I think there's times where we look at this invitation and we're burdened. We have so many cares, and so we come to him and we heed the invitation and we enjoy some moments of blessed rest there at the feet of Jesus Christ. But then as time goes on and we decide to get up and we're going to keep moving, we have 2 choices, right? There's our yoke and there's his yoke. Which one am I going to pick up? And sometimes we come to him after offloading ours and we pick ours back up again. And we go through life carrying it instead of carrying his. And we need to surrender that to him. That's part of this idea. So there's an action that I need to take. There's a yoke that I must wear. Third, we see there is a burden that I must bear. What's this burden that he's talking about? There's a load that we need to pull. We've just given up our burden. Now we find ourselves harnessed to a new one. The burden that Jesus Christ gives to us. And the passage says that it's his yoke. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. His yoke is easy. His burden is light. And now maybe you're thinking to yourself, wait a second, I know some things about what Jesus endured on this earth. I'm not so sure I want to carry that burden. I know what Jesus endured in his life. There was hardship and there was trouble and there was weariness and hunger. There was thirst. He was hated by those that opposed him. I'm not so sure I want to sign up for that. But if that's what's going through your mind, don't back out now, because the process isn't done. We're still in the initiation phase. There's another aspect of this that we're going to get to here in just a moment. And remember that a yoke is meant for how many? for two. And so if I take my yoke off that I'm trying to pull by myself and I put that off to the side, I put his yoke on, who's right next to me pulling along with me? Jesus is. I take off mine and I put on his. The yoke is meant for two. It's his yoke. But what does that mean? It means that when I pull his yoke and his burden, I've got to do it his way. I've got to go in his direction. I've got to go at his pace. I've got to pull his load. But when I do that, I find that this burden pulled his way and with his help is easy and it's light. What a wonderful truth that we see here. So we see the idea here as far as this demand in this initiation phase. It demands surrender. Secondly, it demands discipleship. Say, well, Pastor Mark, where do you see that in the passage? Well, look what he says. He says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. What is a disciple? If you boil it down to the final point there, what's the idea? It's a pupil learning from his master. In fact, this word learn here is a cognate. It's a root form of the same word for disciple. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He says, I want you to come to me and I want you to learn of me. The word learn means to study in order to know and to understand. It's the idea of actively observing something. And so we learn by hearing and listening to his word for sure, but we also learn by experiencing as we're yoked together with him. That's part of the process. Well, who am I supposed to learn about? It's pretty clear in the text. I'm supposed to learn of him. He says, learn of me. That little word of there can be learn about me. It can also be learn from me. Both of those ideas are there. We see the example of Christ and his experience. We watch how he did life. We watch how he responded. And then now as I'm walking through this life yoked to him beside me, I see how he does life as well, and I experience that with his presence as we do life yoked together. As you think through the gospel accounts, do you ever see Jesus frantic or anxious? Do you ever see him just get all agitated and worked up? We see a couple times where he got angry, but we never see him out of control. We never see him frantic. We never see him agitated. We never hear Jesus saying, Peter, if you do that one more time, I'm going to wring your neck. We might have thought about that a few times as we're thinking through what they experienced as they did life together. Remember, the disciples are walking with Jesus 24/7, right? They're living with him, unless he sent them off on different missions. You know what it's like in your home. The people you love the most can drive you nuts. I'm sure that happened with the disciples and Jesus at times. But do you ever see Jesus getting agitated? Do you ever see unrest in his soul? We don't see that there. And so he says, come alongside me, learn of me, learn about me, learn from me. And then he tells us two things that we're supposed to learn. Number one, he says, learn of me that I am meek. Learn meekness. Now, I'm not going to delve into this in a lot of depth right now. We'll probably take some time later in our study to look at what this means, because meekness and then lowliness are two important aspects of learning and understanding peace. If we're going to learn these about Christ, what is meekness? Well, I think it's a word that gets a bad rap, because oftentimes we see that M in front of it, and as guys especially, we want to flip it upside down. Instead of meekness, we want to see weakness. And it's not that at all. It's not that at all. But yet we have that mentality in this world today. It's not weakness, it's strength, but it's strength that's under control. And here Jesus, the I am, the self-existent, self-sustaining creator of the universe, describes himself as meek. If he can claim that characteristic, we can claim that characteristic as well. We must. It's not weakness. It means gentle and mild. It means strong but submissive. It kind of sounds like that ox, doesn't it? That's willing to surrender itself to the yoke that's put upon him. I think we can see that Jesus Christ submitted himself to his Father's yoke. And now he's asking us to submit our necks to his yoke and to do it in meekness. To learn meekness as we yoke up and pull the load together with him. So meekness is one quality here that we're to learn. Secondly, he says he is lowly in heart. How many of you, if you were to list 5 adjectives that described yourself, how many of you would say lowly would make the top 5? Probably not for most of us, right? No, we don't really see that as a positive characteristic. And yet Jesus says that at the core of who I am meek. At the center of who I am lowly in heart. The word literally means not rising far off the ground. That's what the word means. How many of you, this will take you back to your childhood, ever read books by author Richard Scarry? Busy Town, USA, does that ring a bell a little bit? There's a character in those stories named Lowly. What was Lowly? He was a worm, not rising far off the ground, right? And there's some interesting lessons that you can learn as you go back and even read some of these childhood stories, right? That helps us understand what this word means. It's often translated as humility, of putting others first, of not being self-absorbed, not being proud or arrogant, gladly willing to serve other people and looking for opportunities to do so. I'm convinced that there was a group of young men and a group of older men yesterday that demonstrated this characteristic of lowliness as they served, came alongside individuals and were a blessing to them. It's part of what this is talking about. But it's interesting, we see Jesus saying, I am lowly in heart. Why does he qualify it that way? Well, I think it's because deep down inside is what he's talking about. This lowliness is not something that we put on for show. It's something that we really are. It's something that we have to be on the inside. It has to be the real deal. It was with Jesus, and it needs to be that way with us. And so we could repeat what we said before. The I am, the self-existent, self-sustaining creator of the universe is also lowly. And if he can be called lowly, so can we. And we should adopt that characteristic in our lives as well. I think there's another thought here in this idea of being lowly in heart, not rising far off the ground. Perhaps we can give the idea here that Jesus is accessible. Jesus is approachable. Is Jesus the creator of the universe? Is he up here? Absolutely. But he's brought himself down here so that we can approach him, so that we can come to him like he calls us to here in this passage. What a wonderful truth. And so what we see is that Jesus is calling us to a surrendered discipleship where he purposely removes our yoke and we submissively accept his yoke. And we begin to pull in tandem with him. And as we do, we're learning meekness and we're learning humility as we go. So the question is, are we willing to yoke up and learn of him? Are we willing to offload our burden, even this burden that may be defining us? Are we willing to put that off to the side and surrender control? Stop trying to solve the problems on our own, so that we can now come and experience rest. It's essentially what he's saying. And I can't make that decision for you, and you can't make that decision for me. It's a decision that we have to make on our own. But if we're willing to do that, what's going to happen? We're going to title this part of the outline The Implications. There's probably a better way to say it. But what's going to be true of you and me if I'm willing to follow this process, this initiation process of going through and laying down my burden and picking up his yoke and carrying his burden? 3 thoughts here. Number 1, you will find rest. That's what he says. Ye shall find rest unto your souls at the end of verse 29. Let's just explore this in 5 ways here quickly. First of all, we see the person. Who is it that's going to find rest? It's you shall find rest to your soul. That's you and me. You, the one that came beaten down and pummeled and overburdened like we saw last week in our message. You, the one who trusted him enough to leave your yoke and take up his yoke. You, the one who surrendered your neck and began pulling his load his way. You shall find rest unto your soul. Secondly, we see the promise. You shall find rest. Again, it's in the indicative mode, just like we saw last week. It's not the subjunctive. And for those of you English grammarians out there, the subjunctive mode is the mode of possibility. Like flip a coin. There's a 50-50 chance that maybe this is going to work. No, it's not in that mode. It's in the indicative mode. That's the mode of certainty. There's no ambiguity here. There's no doubt about it. If you come to Christ this way, you shall find rest. It's a promise that we see from God himself. There's a person, there's a promise. Third, we're going to see there's a process. He says, you shall find rest. Earlier in verse 28, he says, I will give you rest. And the give really isn't part of that. It's I will rest you. I will cause you to rest. Here he says, you will find rest. And this was an interesting word as I was thinking about that this week. The word means to come upon something or to encounter something as you move along. You're walking along and all of a sudden you encounter something. You see it, you find it. I think part of the idea here is rest doesn't find me, I end up finding it. Do you see how this fits together with this idea of take up and with learn that we just saw before, these commands that he's given to us? I think this is the idea. As you come to him and you offload your burden and you take up his burden, his yoke, and you begin to pull his load his way with him, you're going through life with him beside you, and you're doing life, you're doing the burdens, you're doing the hard things. As you begin pulling together, somewhere along that path, you are going to find rest. The rest comes as you step out in faith and as you begin moving and pulling in tandem with your Lord. Somewhere along that path, you'll find rest. It doesn't come necessarily initially. I think there will be part of that. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But this rest that he's speaking about here, this long-term rest comes as I step out in faith and I begin to pull his load his way. We could say it this way. If coming and taking and learning, these three verbs here, if those are prerequisites to rest, then rest and peace are the blessed benefits of coming and taking and learning. We could say it another way. Rest is found in the process of coming and taking and learning, but it requires that we step out in faith. Don't just step down this road and take a few steps and say, it didn't work. I don't feel peace. I don't feel rest in my soul. Give it some time. Keep going down that road with Jesus Christ, and you will come to that point where you will experience rest. He promises that in this passage. So we see a person, a promise, the process. Number 4, we see the provision. You shall find rest. And we looked at this last week, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but this means the ability to recover and regain your strength. It's the idea of a quiet calm and a patient expectation. It's a divine refreshing. The idea here is that we're made to rest. Permission has been granted for us to offload that burden. There's so much there in that word. We will find rest. But there's a fifth aspect, and this is a little different than what we see in verse 28. Here we see the place or the position of this rest. He says, you shall find rest unto your soul. When you're tired, where do you first think you need to feel rest? In your body. You're just worn down. You're struggling. And I'm not discounting that. Rest is important. But here he says, I'm going to give you rest in your soul. An internal rest precisely placed at the source of your unrest. A rest that doesn't merely treat the symptom. It addresses the true cause. Not the immediate cessation of physical toil or the sudden elimination of all of our burdens and griefs. Often we're going to find that as we're yoked with Christ, we're still carrying some of those same burdens. It doesn't mean that they're all going to go away, but it's a quieting of our soul in the midst of them. Folks, this rest is way more than a good night's sleep, although a good night's sleep can do wonders. Again, I'm not discounting that. This rest solves a lot more than a rejuvenating weekend away or a week-long cruise to the Caribbean. There's some folks here that know something about that. And again, I'm not discounting those things. We need those physical, tangible breaks. But what he's talking about here is a rest of body and mind and soul and spirit, a divine rest that can only come from the God who created us. And until that rest is obtained, the rest of those will only be superfluous. They're not going to accomplish what we want them to accomplish. You know, it's interesting here that rest is mentioned twice. Did you see that in this passage? We see it mentioned in verse 28, and then we also see it there in verse 29. Was Jesus just being redundant? Was he saying the same thing twice so that we'd get the point? Maybe that's part of the idea here. But you know, I think there's more going on. I think in verse 28, there is an initial rest in the coming to Christ. I believe he gives us rest as we come to him. This releasing of the burden brings an immediate for that type of rest. But there's also a lasting rest in staying. The learning of him and from him, that's what brings the sustaining rest. And I wonder if that might be the idea here. Coming to him will give you rest. Abiding in him and learning from him will give permanence to that rest. That's what gives rest its staying power. And so if all I do is come to him and then I leave, and then a little later I come back to him again, and then I leave, and then I come back to him again, I'm going to experience those moments of rest. But it's only when I come to him and yoke up with him and walk with him and be his disciple that I'm going to experience permanence in that rest, a rest with staying power. So we see the first implication, we'll find rest. Secondly, we'll see that we'll find his yoke is easy. His yoke is easy. Well, what does that mean? We talked about the fact that we can struggle sometimes coming to the Lord and being willing to let go of our burden. But as we do that, we're going to find that those fears in doing that are unfounded. This word easy means good and manageable and pleasant and comfortable. Those aren't words you usually associate with a yoke and with burdens and pulling a load, are they? It's often used to describe the kindness of God to his children. Again, not a word that we're going to generally associate with this thought of carrying a yoke. The root word means to be fit or fitted. The idea is to be tailor-made. How many of you have ever had an article of clothing tailor-made for you? Like you went in, I took your measurements, and they ended up, fitting it to you perfectly. Did that an article of clothing fit better than probably anything else in your closet, right? Because it was tailor-made to fit you. And that's part of the idea here when he says, my yoke is easy. My yoke is tailor-made just for you. It's a custom fit. And because it's a custom fit, it's good and it's pleasant and it's comfortable, and it makes pulling this burden a lot more manageable. I think Jesus understood some things about yokes. And I don't know that I can necessarily prove this point, but it's an interesting thought as we go into this. What was Jesus' occupation before he went into his public ministry? He was a carpenter. There's not a lot of wood there in Israel. You've got olive wood, there's acacia wood. They don't have these vast forests that we see dotting our landscape all around here in the Northwest, right? And so they were limited in how much wood they had. And so there wasn't a lot that was made that way. They didn't have, their whole house full of wooden furniture. One of the things I believe Jesus would have made as a carpenter in Israel would have been yokes. Would have been something that he would have made. And as I was researching this just a little bit, one of the books that I was reading said that the yoke was not a buy off the shelf item. In other words, you wouldn't just come in and there'd be a whole rack of yokes hanging on the wall. You grab one and take it home. What they would do is they would bring the oxen in and they would actually tailor make. They take measurements. It seems kind of weird, doesn't it? Take measurements of the ox, and they would get it. The carpenter then would get things roughed out. The oxen would then be brought back and they'd put it on their neck and they'd fine tune it. He'd take a little bit off over here, maybe take a little bit off over here, until it just fit those oxen perfectly. What does that mean? One side was going to be a little bit different than the other side because they were tailor-made to fit each one of those animals. I think it's Barclay that mentions, one of the commentators I was reading, mentions the legend that Jesus made the best ox yokes in all of Galilee. If Jesus made yokes, he made good ones. We know that because he was the Son of God. But they're running with this story a little bit, and even kind of, I think, maybe taking a little poetic license, but the idea that maybe above his carpenter shop, buy my yokes fit well. But that was the thought, that was the idea, that people would come from miles around to have Jesus make a yoke for their oxen, because the ones he made fit well. Is it possible that Jesus is taking an object lesson from his time in the carpenter shop, making physical yokes for physical oxen and saying, hey, you come unto me. I know how to make yokes. I know how to make yokes that will fit you. My yoke will be tailor-made to fit your neck. It won't chafe. It won't dig into your shoulders. My yoke is easy. My burden pulled my way is light. What an interesting thought to think about that idea. That may be where this idea is coming from as far as that object lesson. But there's a third implication that we'll see here. Not only do we find rest, not only do we find that his yoke is easy, we find that his burden is light. The word burden that we see here in verse 30 is a derivative of what we saw in verse 28, the idea of being heavy laden. It's a cognate of that same word. And so it just means what it sounds like. It's the load that we're going to pull with his yoke. Now that we're hooked up to the yoke, the harness is behind us, and we're going to be pulling his load. That burden is what it's talking about. It's the freight of a ship. And back to that same analogy we saw last week, right? How we can be so overloaded with burdens that were beyond our control. We had no say in how heavy the burden was or how many were piled on. But when we came to Jesus Christ and we took our burden off and we accepted his yoke, we submitted to that, we also submitted to his burden. And what does he say we're going to find as we begin to pull that burden? It is light. It doesn't weigh much. It's easy to pull. It's not weighing you down. Having surrendered to his yoke, you find that his burden indeed is light. Why? Because he's pulling together with you in the harness. What a wonderful promise. You know, it reminds me of 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7 and following. Paul makes this comment. He says, our light affliction, which is but for a moment. It's the same word that we see here. But if you back up in the context, was Paul experiencing light affliction from our perspective? No, he says, we're troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed. Always bearing about in the body the dying of the Lord Jesus, that the life also of Jesus might be made manifest in our body. For the which cause we faint not. But though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. And then he says this, for our light affliction. Light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. But we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Was Paul facing affliction there? Yeah, he was facing affliction beyond what we could ever imagine. But because he was harnessed to Jesus Christ and he was pulling the load with Jesus, he viewed that as light. And friends, it'll be the same with us. When we come to him and we lay our burden down and we pick up his burden and we carry it his way, we'll find that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. As we conclude the message here this morning, maybe we'll ask a couple questions. Where's your soul at today? Is your soul in a state of unrest? Are you struggling with some things in your life that are burdening you and causing angst? God doesn't want us to live this way. He's asking us to come to him this morning with our overwhelming burden and to submissively exchange his yoke for our yoke. To harness up to him and begin the process of learning more of him, learning his meekness, learning his humility. And as we do, we're going to find that everything he said was true. We'll indeed find rest to our souls. We'll find that his yoke is easy, and we will find that his burden is light. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, it's tailor-made, it's custom fit, and my burden is light.